Evening, friend. Come sit by the fire. Got a story tonight about a man who never wanted to be anyone's sheriff, and the 7 days that proved he already was. Pour yourself something warm, settle in, and let me tell you about Walt Gibbs and the empty chair in Creston. The first thing Walt Gibbs said when the town council offered him the badge was, "I'm a railroad man." The second thing he said was, "I don't know anything about being a sheriff." The third thing he said, after a long silence, after looking at the badge sitting on the table between them, after looking at the faces of the 5 men who had come to his door on a Tuesday morning because they had run out of other options, was 1 week, just until someone proper steps up. Nobody proper stepped up. And in 7 days, Walt Gibbs made 3 decisions that the town of Creston would talk about for the next 30 years. Welcome to Western Sleep Story, where the Old West carries you to sleep. Every week, I sit by this fire and tell a new tale, slow, calm, with nothing but the crackle of the flame, and a story worth drifting off to. If you're new here, you're welcome to stay as long as you like. And if these stories help you rest, that little subscribe button means you'll never have to look for the fire again. It'll be right here, waiting. Creston was a railroad town. It had been built around the junction where 2 rail lines met in the flat country of eastern Colorado. Not a planned town exactly. Not the kind of place that someone had drawn on a map and decided would exist, but the kind that grew up around necessity, around the fact that men and supplies needed to be somewhere between the larger places, that junctions required maintenance crews, and maintenance crews required somewhere to sleep and eat and spend their wages on a Saturday night. By 1879, it had about 300 residents, a main street with 11 buildings, 2 churches that had never quite agreed on anything, a school, a freight depot, and the kind of economy that ran on rail work and the services that rail workers needed. It was not a violent town. It had its share of the ordinary trouble that frontier towns had. The occasional Saturday night fight outside the saloon, the land disputes that came with expansion, the petty theft, and the minor grievances that accumulate wherever people live close together without enough space between them. But it was not a dangerous place, not by the standards of the territory. Sheriff Donovan had managed it for 22 years, without firing his weapon in the line of duty more than twice, and both times had been warning shots. He was a steady man, Donovan, unexcitable, the kind of lawman who resolved most situations by the weight of his presence rather than by any particular threat of force. He died on a Sunday morning in March of 1879, in his sleep, at the age of 64. His heart, the doctor said, quiet and complete. He had gone to bed on Saturday night and had not woken up. And his deputy, a young man named Tanner who had been in the job for 8 months and who was, by general agreement, not yet ready for the full weight of it, had found him in the morning when he came to open the office. The town grieved in its practical way. There was a service at the Methodist Church on Wednesday. Half the town attended. People said good things about Donovan, which were true, and the preacher said the usual words, which were also true in their way. They buried him in the South Cemetery with his badge pinned to his coat, because that was what he would have wanted. And then the chair behind the desk in the Creston jailhouse was empty, and the town had to figure out what to do about it. The town council met on Monday evening, 3 days after Donovan's death, 1 day after the funeral. There were 5 of them. The mayor, a man named Aldrich who ran the general store, the owner of the freight depot, the Methodist minister, and a rancher named Beauchamp, who represented the interests of the cattle operations south of town. They met in the back room of the general store around a table with a lamp on it, and they talked about the badge. Tanner, the deputy, was the obvious first choice. He was asked. He said, with an honesty that the council later came to respect, that he was not ready, that he knew what he didn't know, and what he didn't know was too much for the full job right now. He would stay on as deputy, he said, and he would do everything he could, but the badge should go to someone with more experience. The council thanked him and moved on. The second choice was a man named Hargrave, no relation to the way station woman on the Millfield route, who had been a lawman in Kansas for several years before coming to Creston to run a small freighting operation. He was asked on Monday evening. He said he was done with law work and meant it, and that they should find someone else. The third choice was a retired Army sergeant named Briggs, who lived on a small spread east of town and who had the bearing and the history for it. He was asked on Tuesday morning. He said his knees were bad and he was too old and he'd probably do more harm than good. And the council privately thought he was probably right, but wished he'd said yes anyway. By Tuesday afternoon, the council was sitting in the back of the general store again, running out of names, when Mayor Aldrich said, "What about Walt Gibbs?" The room went quiet. Not because Walt Gibbs was an alarming suggestion, because he was an unexpected one. Walt Gibbs was a railroad worker. He had been in Creston for 11 years. He was known to everyone and close to no one in the way of certain solitary men who are present in a community without being woven into it. He ate his supper at the diner counter. He kept his house clean and his yard clear. He did his work without complaint and without particular distinction, though the rail foreman had once mentioned in passing that Walt Gibbs was the most reliable man on his crew, and that reliability was rarer than talent and worth more. He had never been in trouble with the law. He had never been in trouble with anyone, as far as the council knew. He was quiet. He was steady. He was, in some way that none of them could fully articulate, the kind of man you trusted without being able to say exactly why. "He's a railroad man," someone said. "He's the only name left on the list," Mayor Aldrich said. They went to his door on Tuesday morning with the badge in a small leather case and 5 expressions that combined hope and apology in roughly equal measure. Walt Gibbs listened to them on his front step. He looked at the badge, he said what he said, and then he picked up the badge and went inside to get his coat. Walt Gibbs walked into the Creston jailhouse for the first time as its acting sheriff on a Tuesday morning in March, and the first thing he did was sit in the chair. Not because he was comfortable, not because he felt he belonged there, but because he understood, in the practical way that he understood most things, that the chair was where the work happened, and if he was going to do the work, he should sit in the chair and find out what the work was. Deputy Tanner was already at the desk when Walt came in, a young man of 26 with an earnest face and the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone who had been holding a situation together by willpower alone for 3 days. He stood up when Walt entered. He looked at the badge on Walt's coat with an expression that was equal parts relief and uncertainty. "Mr. Gibbs?" he said. "Tanner," Walt said. He looked around the office, the desk, the chair, the gun rack on the wall, the door to the 2 cells in the back, the window that faced the main street. He had been inside this office maybe 3 times in 11 years for the ordinary business of a law-abiding citizen. It looked smaller from behind the desk. He sat down. He looked at Tanner. "Tell me what needs attention," he said. Tanner told him. There were 2 ongoing matters. The first was a land dispute between a rancher named Cole and a farmer named Prentice over the boundary line on a shared fence. A dispute that had been simmering for 2 months and that Donovan had been managing through periodic conversations with both men, keeping it below the boiling point. The second was a man who had been in the cells for 4 days on a drunk and disorderly charge, whose fine had been paid but who had nowhere to go, and whom Tanner had been quietly allowing to stay because the nights were cold. And the man, whose name was Edgar, appeared to have no other shelter. Walt listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he said, "What would Donovan have done about Cole and Prentice?" Tanner thought about it. He would have ridden out to the fence line with both of them and had them show him the disputed section. Then he would have listened to each man without comment and told them he'd think about it. Would that have helped? Sometimes, Tanner said. Donovan was good at making men feel heard. Even when he didn't rule in their favor, they generally felt he'd understood their side. That took the pressure out of it usually. Walt nodded. He thought about this, about the specific skill of making a man feel heard, which was not the same as agreeing with him. He was not sure he had that skill. He had spent 11 years being a man of few words, and few words were not always what a situation required. "And Edgar?" he said. Tanner looked slightly embarrassed. "He's been quiet. He helps with sweeping out the cells in the morning. I've been giving him coffee." Then he said, "Has he eaten today?" "Not yet." "Take him over to the diner," Walt said. "Tell May to put it on the office account." He paused. "And find out if he has family somewhere. A man sleeping in a jail cell in March usually has a reason for it." Tanner looked at him. Then he nodded and went to the back. Walt sat at the desk alone for a moment. He looked at the surface of it, the papers, the logbook, the inkwell, the small wooden box where Donovan had kept his pen nibs. Everything neat. Donovan had been a neat man. Walt was also a neat man. That at least was familiar ground. He pulled the logbook toward him and began to read. He spent most of Tuesday reading. The logbook went back 12 years, and he read all of it. Every entry Donovan had made in his careful, plain hand, about every incident and dispute and matter that had come through the office. He was not a fast reader, but he was a thorough one. By evening, he had a reasonable picture of what the town's law had looked like for the past decade, which disputes tended to recur, which families caused the most trouble and why, which situations required presence and which required both. On Wednesday morning, day 2, he rode out to the fence line between the Cole and Prentice properties. He went alone. He had not told either man he was coming, which turned out to be the right decision, because it meant he could look at the fence line without either man performing their grievance at him. He stood at the disputed section for about 20 minutes, looking at the posts, the survey markers, the lay of the land. He was a man who understood physical things, who could read a fence line the way he could read a rail bed, who knew when something had been moved and when it had settled naturally, and when the ground itself had shifted the boundaries over time. He looked at the fence line and he understood what had happened. The posts on the eastern section were newer than the posts on the western section. Someone had re-driven them within the last year based on the weathering, and they had moved the line about 4 feet north of where the original posts had been, which was evident from the faint impressions in the ground where the old holes had been filled. He rode back to town and sent a message to Cole, asking him to come to the office at 2 o'clock. He sent the same message to Prentice, but for 3 o'clock. He would not resolve the dispute on day 2. But he had seen what he needed to see. Cole came at 2 o'clock, which Walt had expected, because Cole was the kind of man who arrived exactly on time as a demonstration of his seriousness. He was a rancher in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with the manner of a man accustomed to being right and unaccustomed to being challenged. He sat in the chair across the desk from Walt Gibbs and looked at the railroad worker, wearing Donovan's badge with an expression that was careful and not entirely respectful. "You're the new sheriff," Cole said. "Acting sheriff," Walt said. "Temporarily, I heard." Cole looked at the desk. "You ride out to the line?" "This morning," Walt said. Cole's expression shifted slightly. He had not expected that. "And?" "I'd like to hear your side first," Walt said. Cole told his side. He had owned the property for 16 years. The fence line had been established by mutual agreement with the previous Prentice, the current man's father, in 1868. The boundary was clear. Prentice's boy had moved it. Simple as that. Walt listened without comment. When Cole finished, Walt said, "Thank you. I'll let you know what I decide." Cole looked at him. "That's it. For now," Walt said. Cole left, not entirely satisfied, but not entirely dissatisfied either, which was roughly what Walt had aimed for. Prentice came at 3. He was younger, early 30s, and had the defensive posture of a man who knows he is being accused of something and is not sure how to carry it. He sat down across from Walt and immediately began explaining. His father had established the line in 1868, he said, but his father had been wrong. The original survey, which he had found in his father's papers after the old man died, showed the boundary 4 feet further north than where the fence had been built. The fence had always been in the wrong place. He had simply corrected it. Walt listened to all of this. Then he said, "Do you have the survey?" Prentice did. He had brought it folded in his coat pocket, anticipating that it would be needed. He spread it on the desk. Walt looked at it carefully. He was not a surveyor, but he could read a document, and the document said what Prentice said it said. "Why didn't you show this to Cole before you moved the posts?" Walt said. Prentice was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I tried. He wouldn't look at it. Said the fence had been there for 11 years, and that was that." Walt nodded slowly. He folded the survey and set it on the desk. "Leave this with me," he said. "I'll talk to Cole again tomorrow." He rode out to Cole's property the next morning with the survey in his coat pocket. He showed it to Cole without preamble. Just laid it on the table in Cole's kitchen and let him look at it. Cole looked at it for a long time. His jaw was tight. Walt waited. "He should have showed me this first," Cole said finally. "He said he tried," Walt said. "You didn't look at it." Cole was quiet. "The survey says the line is where Prentice put it," Walt said. "The fence is now in the right place. That's the decision." He paused. "But I want you to hear something else." Cole looked at him. "Prentice is your neighbor," Walt said. "He'll be your neighbor after I give this badge back next week and long after I'm gone. The fence is settled. How you two get along after this, that's not settled. That's up to you." He picked up the survey and handed it back to Cole. "I'd think about that." He rode back to town. The land dispute did not disappear overnight. Cole and Prentice did not become friends. But the posts stayed where they were, and by summer, the two men had developed the functional, if reserved, relationship of neighbors who have agreed, without saying so, that the conflict is not worth the cost of continuing it. That was Walt's first decision. Edgar's full name was Edgar Marsh, and he was 47 years old, and he had come to Creston 6 months ago from somewhere in Missouri that he didn't talk about much. Tanner had found out, over the 3 days Edgar had been in the cells, that he had a brother in Denver, that he had worked as a carpenter for most of his adult life, and that something had happened in Missouri, something he would not describe directly, but that had clearly taken most of the solid ground out from under him, and that he had been drifting since, working where he could find work, sleeping where he could find shelter, spending his wages on the particular anesthetic that wages could be spent on in frontier towns. Walt talked to Edgar on Wednesday evening, after Tanner had gone home. He sat in the chair across from Edgar at the small table in the common area between the cells, with 2 cups of coffee, the way he sat across from anyone he needed to talk to, without drama, without the particular weight that authority sometimes puts on a conversation. Just 2 men with coffee, in a warm room in the cold of March. Edgar talked. It took a while, and it came out in pieces, and Walt did not rush it. He had learned, in 11 years on a railroad crew, that some men talked in straight lines and some men talked in circles, and the circles were usually the ones that mattered. He let Edgar circle. What had happened in Missouri was a fire. Edgar's house, his workshop, everything he had built over 20 years, gone in one night. His wife had gotten out. He had gotten out. But something in him had not gotten out, and he had been trying to figure out what to do about that ever since. Walt listened to all of it. Then he said, "You're a carpenter." "Was," Edgar said. "Creston is building a new schoolhouse addition in the spring," Walt said. "The foreman is a man named Davies. He's been looking for a good carpenter since October." He paused. "I know Davies. He's a fair man. The work would last through summer at least." Edgar looked at his coffee cup. "I haven't been reliable lately," he said. "I know," Walt said. "I'll tell Davies that. I'll also tell him you're the best carpenter I've seen." He paused. "That second part will only be true if it's true. Is it true?" Then, quietly, "Yes." "Then that's what I'll tell him," Walt said. He talked to Davies the next morning. Davies was skeptical. A man with a history of unreliability was a risk on a construction job. Walt told him that Edgar had reasons for what he'd been, and that reasons were not the same as character, and that in his judgment Edgar's character was sound. He said he would vouch for the man personally. Davies said he would give Edgar 2 weeks. Edgar worked on that schoolhouse addition for 4 months. He did not miss a day. He was, as he had said, a very good carpenter, and Davies said so to anyone who asked, and several people who didn't. By summer, Edgar Marsh had a room at the boarding house on Cedar Street and a small savings account at the Creston Bank, and the beginning of a new solid ground to stand on. That was Walt's second decision. Now, if you're still awake and this fire's keeping you company tonight, I'm glad you're here. If you'd like more nights like this, a subscribe and a quiet little tap on that bell means I can keep these stories coming, one fire at a time. But for now, let's get back to where we were. The trouble at the Creston Saloon began on Thursday evening, day 4 of Walt's week, and it was the kind of trouble that had the potential to become something serious if it wasn't handled correctly in the first hour. 2 men from a cattle outfit passing through town had been drinking since mid-afternoon. By 7 in the evening they were loud, and by 8 they were the kind of loud that changed the atmosphere in a room, that made the regular patrons quiet and watchful, that made the barkeep move carefully and say little, that had the particular edge of men who were not just drunk but looking for something to be drunk at. The barkeep sent his boy for Tanner, who came to find Walt at the diner counter, where Walt was eating his supper with his usual unhurried attention. Walt listened to Tanner's description of the situation. Then he finished his supper, paid his bill, and walked to the saloon. He did not go in immediately. He stood outside for a moment, listening. The voices inside were loud, but not yet at the pitch that preceded breaking things. He pushed open the door and walked in and stood just inside the entrance, letting his eyes adjust to the lamplight. The 2 men from the cattle outfit were at the bar. They were big men, trail-hardened, road-dirty, the kind of men who had been in the open for weeks and were now inside with whiskey, which was a combination that sometimes went fine and sometimes didn't. They had been talking loudly at the barkeep, who was maintaining a professional neutrality that was clearly costing him some effort. The rest of the saloon had gone quiet when Walt came in. Not because Walt Gibbs was an imposing figure. He was not particularly a man of average height and build, with a quiet face and a railroad worker's hands. But there was a badge on his coat and the badge changed the room. The two men at the bar turned around. Walt walked to the bar. He stood next to the closer of the two men, not confrontationally, just present. The way you stand next to someone when you intend to talk to them rather than at them. He looked at the barkeep. 2 coffees, he said. The barkeep looked at him. Then he turned and got the coffee. Walt looked at the two men. They looked back at him with a particular assessment of men deciding whether the person in front of them was worth the trouble of a confrontation. "You're passing through?" Walt said. His voice was the same voice he used for everything. Level, unhurried, without threat. The closer man said they were, headed north in the morning to the Beauchamp Ranch for a cattle pickup. "Long ride," Walt said. He accepted the 2 cups of coffee from the barkeep and set them on the bar in front of the two men. "These are on the office." The men looked at the coffee, then at Walt, then at each other. There was a moment that could have gone either way, the way moments in saloons sometimes balanced on very small things. And then the closer man picked up the coffee cup, and the other man followed. And something went out of the room, some tension that had been building since mid-afternoon, like air going out of something that had been inflated too hard. Walt stayed for about 20 minutes. He drank a coffee himself at the end of the bar and talked to the two men about the road north and the Beauchamp Ranch and the general state of the cattle business in Colorado that spring. They were, under the whiskey and the road weariness, ordinary men, not bad men, not looking for real trouble, just men who had been too long on the trail and had needed the pressure to come off somewhere. They left the saloon at 9 o'clock, reasonably sober, and went to their bedrolls at the livery stable. The barkeep caught Walt's eye as he was leaving and nodded. A single nod, the kind that means more than its size suggests. Walt nodded back and went home. On Friday morning, day 5, Walt came into the office early and found Tanner already there, as he had been every morning, with coffee made and the logbook open. Walt had been watching Tanner all week. Not obviously. Walt watched most things without making it obvious, but carefully, in the way that a man watches another man when he is trying to understand what that man is capable of and what he is not. What he had seen was this. Tanner was careful. He was honest. He had good instincts about people, the kind of instincts that couldn't be taught, that came from paying attention over time and caring about what you observed. He lacked confidence, which was a different thing from lacking ability. He had been 8 months in a job where he was always the second man, always following Donovan's lead, always operating in the shadow of 22 years of established authority. He had not yet had occasion to find out what he was when he was the first man. Walt sat down at the desk. He poured himself a coffee. He looked at Tanner. "Tell me about the Morrison complaint," he said. The Morrison complaint was a minor matter. A woman on the east side of town who had reported that her neighbor's dog had been getting into her kitchen garden for the 3rd time this month. It was not, strictly speaking, a sheriff's office matter, but it was the kind of thing that came to the office anyway, because in a small town, the sheriff's office was where people brought things they didn't know where else to bring. Tanner had handled it on Thursday. He had gone to speak to the neighbor, a man named Goss, and had apparently had a reasonable conversation and come away with a promise that the dog would be better secured. "You handled that well," Walt said. Tanner looked slightly surprised. "It wasn't much." "No," Walt said, "but the way you handled it will matter to Mrs. Morrison for a long time. People remember how small things are dealt with more than they remember the big ones." He paused. "You have good judgment, Tanner. You know that?" Tanner was quiet for a moment. "Donovan used to say I was too cautious." "Donovan was right that you're cautious," Walt said. "He was wrong that it's a problem. Caution and hesitation are different things. You're cautious. You think before you act. That's not a weakness in this job." He paused. "The hesitation, the part where you don't trust your own read on a situation, that goes away with time. You just have to be in the job long enough to see that your read was right more often than it was wrong." Tanner looked at the coffee cup in his hands. "You should take the badge," he said. "After the week, not me. You." Walt shook his head. "I'm a railroad man," he said. Not as a dismissal, as a fact that was also a complete sentence. "You're good at this," Tanner said. "I'm adequate at this for 1 week," Walt said. "That's different from good. You'll be good at it." He picked up his own cup. "You just need to believe that before someone else tells you it's true." They sat in the office for a while, the morning quiet outside, the coffee warm in the cups, and Walt talked to Tanner about the cases in the logbook, about how Donovan had handled certain recurring situations, about the patterns he had noticed in the 12 years of entries, about the specific qualities that each of the town's trouble spots required. Not as a lecture, as a conversation. The way a man passes something on when he understands that passing it on is part of the job. On Saturday, day 6, a man rode into Creston that Walt had not been expecting. His name was Reeves, and he was a territorial marshal, and he had been in the area on other business when word reached him that Creston was operating without a permanent sheriff. He came into the office at mid-morning, a tall man in his 40s with a marshal's star and the manner of someone used to assessing situations quickly. He looked at Walt behind the desk. He looked at the badge on Walt's coat. "Acting sheriff," he said. "Temporarily," Walt said. 1 week. Reeves sat down in the chair across the desk. He had a list of names, men with law experience in the territory who might be available for the Creston position permanently. He went through the list with Walt and Tanner, discussing each name, the qualifications, the likely interest. It was a reasonable list. There were 2 names on it that Walt thought were genuinely good options. Experienced men, steady records, the kind of background that the Creston position needed. At the end of the conversation, Reeves looked at Walt. "There's another option," Reeves said. Walt waited. "You," Reeves said. "I've been asking around town since I rode in this morning. Everyone I talked to said the same thing. You've handled this week well. The Cole Prentice matter. The saloon situation Thursday night." He paused. "Tanner tells me you have good judgment." Walt looked at Tanner, who had the expression of a man who has said exactly what he meant and does not apologize for it. "I'm a railroad man," Walt said. "You keep saying that," Reeves said. "Not unkindly." Because it keeps being true, Walt said. Reeves leaned back in his chair. He looked at Walt for a long moment, with the assessing gaze of a man who had spent a career reading people under pressure. "Why did you say yes?" Reeves asked. "When the council came to you, why did you take the badge?" Walt thought about this. He had not been asked directly before, and he had not asked himself directly before either, which was perhaps an oversight. "Because somebody had to," he said, "and nobody else would." "That's a reason to do something for a day," Reeves said. "Not a week. You've done a week." "Why?" Walt was quiet for a long moment. "Because the town needed it done right," he said finally. "Not just done right." He paused. "I don't know if I did it right, but I tried to." Reeves nodded slowly. He looked at the desk, at the logbook, at the badge on Walt's coat. "I'm going to write up a recommendation," Reeves said, "to the territorial office for a permanent appointment." He paused. "I'm going to put 2 names on it, the 2 from my list, and yours." "Don't put mine," Walt said. "I'm going to put yours," Reeves said. "What the territorial office does with it is their business. What you do with their response is yours." He stood up, picked up his hat. "A man who takes a hard job because somebody has to and nobody else will, that's not a railroad man, Gibbs. That's a lawman." He left. Walt sat at the desk for a long time after Reeves rode out. He looked at the office, the desk, the chair, the gun rack, the window facing the main street, the logbook open in front of him, Donovan's pen nibs in the small wooden box. He thought about what Reeves had said. He thought about Tanner, who deserved the chance to find out what he was capable of. He thought about Cole and Prentice, and their fence line, and the fact that the land dispute had been about the fence, but underneath the fence it had always been about 2 men who had stopped knowing how to talk to each other. He thought about Edgar Marsh, who was starting his 2nd week on the schoolhouse edition and had not missed a day. He thought about the 2 cattlemen drinking coffee in the saloon, the tension going out of the room like air from something inflated too hard. He thought about what a week of paying attention could do. On Sunday morning, day 7, the last day, he came into the office and found Tanner there, as always, with the coffee made. He sat down at the desk. He opened the logbook. He wrote the entries for the week in his careful, plain hand, the way Donovan had written entries for 22 years. The facts of each matter, the action taken, the outcome. When he was finished, he closed the logbook. He looked at Tanner. "You're ready," he said. "You've been ready. You just needed someone to say it." Tanner was quiet for a moment. "Then, will you take it? If Reeves puts your name forward?" Walt picked up the badge. He looked at it for a moment, the metal, the pen, the weight of it in his palm. Then he set it on the desk between them. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I know you'll do the job well in the meantime, and I know that the town is in good hands." He stood up. That was always the thing that needed deciding. That was his third decision. Walt Gibbs went back to the railroad yards on Monday morning. He went back the way he had gone every morning for 11 years, on foot from his house on the edge of town, arriving at the yards before 6, picking up his work where he had left it the week before. The foreman, a man named Jessup who had known Walt for the full 11 years, looked at him when he came through the gate and said, "How was it?" "Educational," Walt said. Jessup looked at him for a moment, the way people looked at Walt when they were trying to read something in his face and not quite getting there. Then he handed him the work orders for the day, and that was the end of it. Creston went about its business. Tanner took the badge on a provisional basis while the territorial office processed Reeves's recommendation. He was, as Walt had said he would be, good at it, careful and thorough and increasingly confident, his judgment settling into the kind of steady authority that a town like Creston required. The coal Prentice fence line stayed where Prentice had put it. Edgar Marsh finished the schoolhouse addition in June and was hired immediately afterward by the largest construction outfit in the county. The 2 cattlemen from the saloon came back through Creston in the fall on a different cattle job and were quiet and orderly and left a good tip for the barkeep. The territorial office sent a letter in April with 3 names for the permanent sheriff position. 2 were from Reeves's list. 1 was Walt Gibbs. The town council met and voted. The vote was not what anyone entirely expected. They voted for Tanner, and when they went to tell Walt, because they felt they owed him that, the man who had held the chair for the week, the man who had said what needed saying to Tanner about his own readiness, they found him at the railroad yards in the middle of a repair job, unhurried and focused in the way he was always unhurried and focused. He listened to the news. He nodded. "That's the right call," he said. And then he went back to work. He stayed in Creston for the rest of his life. He worked the railroad yards until his mid-60s, when his hands started telling him it was time to stop, and then he retired to his small house on the edge of town and grew a kitchen garden and spent his evenings at the diner counter the way he always had. He and Tanner, Sheriff Tanner as he became, had the easy friendship of 2 men who had been honest with each other at the right moment and had never had to be dishonest with each other since. On the day Walt Gibbs died in the winter of 1919, at the age of 83, Tanner retired himself by then. White-haired and slow-moving, but still present, still in Creston, came to sit with him. They sat in the small house on the edge of town by the fire, the way old men sit when there is not much left to say and nothing left to prove. Tanner said, "You should have taken the badge." Walt said, "You needed it more." And Tanner thought about that for the rest of his life and never entirely decided whether it was true or whether it was just the kind of thing Walt. Gibbs said, honest and plain and carrying more inside it than the words themselves could hold. The chair in the Creston jailhouse was not empty for long in the end. Walt Gibbs had made sure of that. And that is the way I heard it told. The fire is getting low now. A man who said he was just a railroad man. 3 decisions in 7 days. A fence line, a carpenter without a floor to stand on. and a young deputy who needed someone to say out loud what he already was. None of those decisions were loud. None of them made the papers. They were just the right thing done at the right time by a man who had said yes when nobody else would. I've thought about Walt Gibbs a good deal, about what it means to step into a hard space not because you want it, but because the space needs filling, and you have what it takes, and about what it means to hand something over at the end, to say, "You're ready," and mean it, and walk back to your own work without looking to see whether you were right. Most of the people who matter most are like that. You don't always know it while it's happening. You rest easy tonight, friend. And if this story gave you a quiet place to land, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who could use a peaceful night. Leave me a word in the comments. Tell me where the fire took you tonight. I read every one. I will be right here next time you need a story. The fire will be burning, same as always. Good night.